Rain drummed softly on the tiled roofs of the mansions of Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood. Victorian houses built at the turn of the century stood proudly above neatly mowed lawns. The three-story red brick mansion with white trim, owned by the Brooks family, stood out among them. In a spacious room on the second floor, 16-year-old Emily leaned over an easel. Her slender fingers steadily drew charcoal across the paper, creating a portrait of a young woman with sad eyes. She glanced at the photograph on the table, a picture of her mother taken 3 years ago before James had come into their lives. Emily remembered the night her mother had first brought him into the house, a tall, trim man with graying whiskers and kind brown eyes. He'd brought her a book, a rare edition of Sylvia Plath's poetry. "I noticed your drawings in my mother's gallery," he said then. "You have a special way of looking at the world, like a true artist." Sarah met James at the opening of a contemporary art exhibit at her gallery. He taught literature at a local college and came with the students. Emily vividly remembered her mother talking about their first meeting. They talked all evening about art, literature, and the influence of classicism on modern culture. James charmed Sarah with his erudition and subtle understanding of beauty. Their romance developed rapidly. After a month, James became a frequent guest in their home, and 5 months later he and Sarah married. The ceremony was modest, only close friends and relatives in the garden of their house. Emily was happy for her mother. After divorcing her father 6 years ago, Sarah was truly smiling for the first time. The Brooks Modern Gallery thrived under Sarah's leadership. She had impeccable taste and business acumen, able to find young talent and promote their work to wealthy collectors. James supported her ambitions, often helping with organizing exhibitions and enlisting his students to volunteer. Emily set the charcoal aside and looked critically at the portrait. Something was off about the expression in her mother's eyes. They looked too wary, almost suspicious. It was the kind of look she'd been catching more and more often lately. The sound of a gong heralded the start of dinner. Emily went down to the dining room where Sarah was already arranging baked trout on plates. James sat at the head of the table reading some papers. "How's the portfolio preparation going?" he asked as Emily sat down at the table. His voice sounded soft with genuine interest. "I've finished a series of self-portraits and started working on a new concept," Emily replied, noticing the way her mother's shoulders tensed. "Will you show me later? I could give you some composition tips." James smiled, and Emily felt a warmth in her chest from his attention. Sarah set her plate down in front of her daughter with excessive force. Emily needs to spend more time on core subjects. Her math grades leave a lot to be desired. Dinner continued in tense silence. Emily watched her mother, noting how Sarah had changed over the past few months. Gone was the former ease. There was a sort of nervousness in her movements. She stayed late at the gallery more often, and at home she checked Emily's cell phone and asked about her every move. As Emily walked upstairs after dinner, she caught her mother's reflection in the mirror. Sarah was standing in the dining room doorway, watching James help her pick up drawings that had accidentally fallen from a folder. Her eyes were dark with underlying anxiety, and her fingers nervously rubbed the pearl necklace, James's first gift to her. In her room, Emily pulled out her journal and wrote, "Mom has changed. It's like she's become a bird of prey, jealously guarding her nest. But from whom? From me? From the ghosts of the past? Or from her own fears?" Outside the window, the rain intensified, drumming on the glass like a harbinger of an impending storm. Emily didn't know that very soon her life would change forever, and this rainy evening would be the last quiet evening in their home. Autumn in Seattle was unusually cold. The chilly wind from the Bay Area crept under their clothes, forcing the city's residents to hide in cozy coffee shops and bookstores. On evenings like this, Emily especially loved James's library, a spacious room on the first floor of their house where the floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with books. Every Tuesday and Thursday, when Sarah stayed late at the gallery, she and James would spend hours here discussing literature and art. He showed her rare editions, talked about authors, shared stories from his teaching practice. Emily eagerly absorbed every word, finding in her stepfather the intellectual companion she had always lacked. "Look at this technique," James said, leafing through an album of Egon Schiele's work. "See how the lines convey the inner tension of the characters?" His fingers slid across the page, casually touching Emily's hand. Those touches sent shivers down her spine, and her heart began to beat faster. Sarah was less and less likely to be home for dinner. Important clients, new exhibition, urgent matters. Her excuses sounded like memorized text, but when she did return, she stood in the library doorway for long periods of time, watching her husband and daughter with an unreadable expression. Emily's school grades were plummeting. She was skipping classes, preferring to spend her time in the school art studio or the town museums. Teachers would call Sarah, expressing concern, but James always rose to his stepdaughter's defense. "She's a creative person," he said during another family council. "You can't measure her success by conventional standards. Look at her work. There's more life and understanding in it than any mathematical formula." Sarah frowned but didn't argue. Increasingly, she locked herself in her office, immersed in some paperwork and phone conversations. One day, returning home earlier than usual, she found Emily's diary forgotten on the kitchen table. The entries were full of confusion and anxiety. "His gaze follows me like a shadow. When he's around, I can't breathe. It's wrong, I know. But can the heart be controlled?" The ensuing quarrel shook the house to its foundations. "You've completely lost your head," Sarah shouted. "What are you thinking about? He's your stepfather, for God's sake!" "You don't understand anything," shouted back Emily. "You've never understood me. You only care about your precious gallery and what people think." After that, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Sarah installed a tracking program on her daughter's phone, forbade her to be alone with James, and hired a tutor who tutored Emily in the gallery under her supervision. James kept a detached demeanor, avoiding direct stares and conversation. He lingered at the college more and more often, citing extra classes with students. But sometimes, when he thought no one could see, he looked at Emily with such pain and tenderness that it took her breath away. One evening, bumping into him in the half-dark hallway, Emily felt his hand linger on her shoulder for a moment. "I'm sorry," he whispered so quietly she rather read it on his lips. There was a darkness in his eyes that made her dizzy. Emily couldn't sleep for a long time that night. She could hear her parents' muffled voices behind the wall. They were arguing again. The words were indistinct, but the intonation spoke for itself. Her mother was demanding something, her voice ringing with barely restrained rage. James answered calmly, but his tone was tired and something else, either guilt or regret. Lying in the dark, Emily thought about how their lives had changed over the past few months. The perfect family they'd tried to build had crumbled like a house of cards in the first gust of wind. Something was coming, something dark and inescapable, like storm clouds over the bay. In her diary, now hidden under a floorboard, she wrote, "Sometimes I think we are all playing parts in some terrible play. Mother is the jealous heroine. I am the naive girl in love with forbidden fruit. And James is like a man walking a tightrope over a precipice. One wrong step and we'll all plummet into the abyss." She didn't know how prophetic those words would be. So far, life had gone on as usual. The gallery, school, the strained smiles at dinner. But there was already the smell of a storm in the air, and the first drops of rain drummed on the roof of the mansion in the Queen Anne neighborhood, heralding a storm that would change their lives forever. On Friday morning, Sarah announced her trip to Portland for an art fair. She took longer than usual to pack her suitcase for the 2-day trip, glancing every now and then at her daughter, who sat in her bedroom chair, defiantly leafing through an art magazine. "Mrs. Rodriguez will be spending the night at the house," Sarah repeated for the 10th time as she carefully stowed her business suits. "I know, Mom," Emily replied monotonously without looking up. Their morning conversations had long ago become a mechanical exchange of phrases, as if they were both performing a memorized role in a never-ending play. James volunteered to drive his wife to the airport. Before leaving, Sarah hugged her daughter for an unexpectedly long time, breathing in the scent of her hair as if trying to memorize the moment. "Be careful, sweetheart," she whispered, and there was a strange mixture of love and fear in her voice. The house had emptied. Mrs. Rodriguez, their housekeeper, was in the kitchen, humming something in Spanish. The sounds of her fiddling came to Emily's room in a muffled background. She locked herself in her room, trying to work on sketches for an upcoming exhibition, but her pencil wouldn't listen. Her thoughts were jumbled and her heart was racing. She knew James would be back from the airport soon. Evening was descending on the city, coloring the sky a dark purple. At times like this, Queen Anne's neighborhood seemed especially picturesque, the old mansions casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets, the warm light in the windows turning the houses into illustrations of Victorian novels. James returned when it was already dark. Emily heard his car door slam, heard him walk up the porch steps and into his office. The door creaked open, and a moment later, soft classical music, Chopin, his favorite nocturne, began to play. Mrs. Rodriguez had set dinner in the dining room with her usual pedantry, silver polished, napkins starched, candles lit. But neither Emily nor James had touched the food. The air was electrified with unspoken words, unshed tears, unfulfilled hopes. After dinner, the housekeeper retired to her room in the annex, leaving them alone in the vast, subdued house. "I found your new artwork in the studio," James said, standing at the library window. His silhouette loomed clearly against the darkening sky. "They're very candid." Emily felt the color flood her cheeks. The series of self-portraits she'd been working on for the past month were too personal. A girl with a face contorted with passion, her shoulders exposed, her head tilted forward. In every stroke, there was desperation. In every line, the thirst for the forbidden. It was like a dream. The first real kiss of her life, with her stepfather, in the darkness of the library. To the sound of a fading nocturne, James's hands trembled as he touched her shoulders, her neck, her back. "We don't have to," he whispered, but he didn't stop. In that moment, the whole world narrowed down to the feel of his touch, to the smell of his cologne, to the taste of his lips. Saturday afternoon passed like a blur. They carefully avoided making eye contact with each other at breakfast. Mrs. Rodriguez talked about her dinner plans, but Emily didn't hear her. Her whole being was focused on the memory of the night before, on the phantom sensation of his hands on her skin. Sarah returned unexpectedly on Saturday night. The fair had ended earlier than planned. She looked tired but satisfied, and had brought gifts, a rare edition of Byron for James, a set of French pencils for Emily. There was an unusual nervousness in her movements, as if she were in a hurry to distribute the gifts, afraid of missing something. At dinner, Sarah talked a lot about the trip, about meeting collectors, about new contracts for the gallery. James kept the conversation going, asking the right questions, smiling in all the right places. Emily was silent, rubbing the high collar of her sweater. But a mother's eye always notices what they try to hide. At one point, Sarah stopped abruptly at half a word, staring at her daughter's neck, where a traitorous trace of passion was visible. The night passed quietly, too quiet. Sunday morning, as soon as it dawned, James left for college, ostensibly to prepare materials for a conference. His Volvo drove out of the gate at 6 in the morning when the town was still asleep. At 9 in the morning, Mrs. Rodriguez went up to the second floor to wake Emily for breakfast. A minute later, her scream tore through the morning silence of the house. Police sirens came on 7 minutes after the 911 call. The first patrol officer to arrive on the scene found the sobbing housekeeper on the porch and the front door open wide. Emily's room was cold. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the wind. There was a dark stain on the light-colored carpet. Sarah was nowhere to be found. Forensics arrived 20 minutes later. They methodically photographed the crime scene, collected evidence, took samples. Neighbors watched in shock from behind the curtains of their immaculate homes. Reporters were already gathering at the gates, smelling a sensation in an affluent neighborhood. James's cell phone was turned off. When the police finally reached the college, the secretary informed them that Professor Foster had canceled all classes due to a family emergency. His car was found abandoned in an airport parking lot. In Emily's bedroom, an unfinished sketchbook lay open on the table. A female figure with a face contorted with rage, her hands at the throat of a young girl. At the bottom was the date, yesterday, and the beginning of a signature. "Mom always said I..." The end of the sentence remained unwritten, nor was the story of a young life cut short in this room somewhere between midnight and dawn. A chilly Seattle morning greeted Detective Catherine Chen with drizzling rain and a howling wind off the bay. She parked her tattered Ford next to patrol cars whose flashers painted the Victorian facade of the Brooks mansion in alarming red and blue colors. Her partner, Mike Donovan, a tall man with premature gray on his temples, was already talking to the patrolman at the entrance. 20 years in homicide had taught him to always arrive first. The rain had picked up, turning the crime scene into a grim film noir setting. Droplets dripped down the gutters of the old mansion, as if the house was crying over the tragedy that had occurred. The Queen Anne neighborhood, usually so orderly and decorous, had lost its charm today, with the worried faces of neighbors hiding behind perfect hedges, and the driveway already occupied by reporters who smelled a scoop. "What have we got?" Chen adjusted the collar of her cloak, trying to shield herself from the gusts of wind. After 25 years in the service, she still wasn't used to Seattle weather. "Victim is Emily Brooks, 16 years old." Donovan handed her the preliminary report, shielding the papers from the rain. Talented artist, studying for art college. The body was discovered by the housekeeper around 9 this morning. Multiple head injuries, probably caused by a blunt object. Murder weapon not yet found. Mother, Sarah Brooks, owner of an art gallery. Disappeared stepfather, James Foster, professor of literature, allegedly left for work early this morning. The house greeted them with an oppressive silence, broken only by the methodical work of the forensics team. There was a heavy smell of metal in the air, the smell of blood that even the scented candles placed throughout the first floor could not break. Investigators in white jumpsuits were working on possible prints. A photographer was taking pictures of every detail. Drops of blood on the light-colored wallpaper, traces of struggle on the floor, scattered things, overturned furniture. In the spacious kitchen with marble countertops and the latest appliances sat an elderly Hispanic woman, Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper. Her hands, holding a cup of long cold tea, were visibly shaking. Bloodstains were visible on her impeccably ironed apron, the marks of her attempt to help Emily when she found the body. "Mrs. Rodriguez? I'm Detective Chen. Tell me how you discovered the body." "I always wake Emily up at 9. The housekeeper's voice shook like an autumn leaf. "Always. She likes to sleep, used to love. On Saturdays I make her blueberry pancakes her favorite. The door was locked. I knocked, and there was silence. I have a spare key Miss Sarah gave me just in case. I opened it and..." The woman burst into tears, tears dripping into the untouched tea. Chen wrote down the statement, noting details. Mrs. Rodriguez had been with the family for 5 years, coming in after Sarah's divorce from her first husband. Saw how relationships in the house had changed since James had arrived 2 years ago. Noticed the growing tension between mother and daughter. Heard some strange noises last night, but thought it was just me. "What about Mr. Foster and Emily's relationship?" The housekeeper hesitated, rubbing the edge of her apron. "He was kind to her, very kind. Helped with her college preparations, gave her art books. Miss Sarah was glad at first that they were getting along, but then something changed." Donovan, meanwhile, studied the victim's room on the second floor. The once perfectly cleaned space had become a crime scene, signs of a struggle on the light-colored carpet, a broken desk lamp, an overturned easel with unfinished work. On the walls were dozens of button-pin drawings, self-portraits in different techniques, sketches of a man's face, over and over again. James Foster in different angles. In every stroke, you could feel the artist's obsession with his model. "Boss, take a look." He held out a photograph he'd found under the mattress to Chen. The shot had been taken in a gallery, Emily and James standing by some painting, his hand resting on her shoulder. But it was the looks that mattered. They looked at each other the way a stepfather and stepdaughter shouldn't. By noon, the experts from the lab had pulled up. The results of the preliminary examination painted a disturbing picture. They found traces of bodily fluids on the sheets that required further analysis. In the bathroom, they found a bloody towel carelessly hidden behind the washing machine. On the carpet in the living room, barely visible traces of blood, which someone tried to scrub with household chemicals. Interviews with neighbors took hours and yielded some surprising results. Mrs. Parker, a gray-haired lady who lives in the house across the street, turned out to be observant, as all lonely retirees are. "Sarah came back on Saturday night. I was just watering the flowers on the veranda. Very strange. because at the book club on Thursday she'd told everyone she wouldn't be back until Sunday, and she looked kind of twitchy. I thought maybe something happened at the gallery. Mr. Jenkins, a retired financial analyst who lives next door on the right, was walking his Labrador around midnight. The screaming woke Buster up. He started barking, women's voices very loud. Thought it showed. The Brookses always have such a decent family. Emily used to pet Buster a lot when we walked by. Such a sweet girl. At St. Mary's private school, where Emily attended, the painting took on new disturbing connotations. Her art teacher, Mr. Chang, showed her recent work. Dark canvases filled with hidden tension. She's always been talented, but in the last year her style has changed, became more intense. Emily withdrew into herself, stopped socializing with her classmates, but her drawings, they screamed, especially the self-portrait series. Look at the repressed passion in them. Mrs. Wilson, the class teacher, recalled a strange conversation with Sarah a month ago. In her office, smelling of chalk and old books, she had shown Chen the records of Emily's falling grades. Mrs. Brooks was very concerned. Talked about bad influences, about the girl being completely out of control. I offered the help of the school counselor, but she refused. She said she could handle it on her own. Surveillance footage from neighboring homes created a clear timeline. At 6 in the morning, James's silver Volvo pulled out of the garage. At 7, a female figure with a suitcase came out of the house, Sarah. But at 8, she returned, already without the suitcase, wearing different clothes. Look, Donovan handed Chen a tattered leather-covered diary he'd found behind a bookcase. The last entry is dated last night. Chen read, and the picture of the crime began to take on a clear, frightening outline. Mom has changed. She watches my every move, checks my phone, reads my letters. Yesterday she found my drawings, the ones where I drew him. She yelled that I'm destroying the family, but what she doesn't understand is that James and I, it's real. I know what I'm doing. She's supposed to be in Portland today and we can finally... The recording cut off halfway through, as if someone had interrupted the writing hand. The forensic results came in the evening, when the rain outside the window turned into a real downpour. Death occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. The murder weapon was a heavy blunt object with a characteristic texture. There were signs of a struggle on the body, and skin particles and fabric fibers were found under the fingernails. Check the airport! Chen spread the crime scene photos on the table. A picture of death captured with the impartiality of police footage. James Foster couldn't have just vaporized. Already, Donovan placed a printout in front of her. Ticket for a flight to Mexico City leaving at 7:30 this morning. But he didn't show up for boarding. His car was left in the long-term parking lot. And Sarah? Her credit card was used at 8:45 at the Pine Grove Motel on the highway toward Portland. Sent a patrol out there. Chen stared at the family photos hanging on the walls of the house. Snapshots from a year ago, happy faces, perfect poses, flawless smiles. A prosperous upper-middle-class family. No one could have guessed that behind that facade, tragedy was brewing. You know what's weird? Donovan tapped his pen on the table, catching his partner's attention. They found a bronze statue in the house, some kind of art award. It has traces of blood on it, but it's too clean. Someone washed it thoroughly, but didn't get rid of it. Why? Because it wasn't a planned murder. Chen gathered the photos into a folder. There was the confidence of someone beginning to see the full picture in her voice. It was rage. Pure, unbridled rage. We need to find both of them. And fast. Her phone rang, breaking the evening silence of the empty house. The patrol found Sarah Brooks's Toyota in the parking lot of the Pine Grove Motel, 2 hours out of town. The room was empty, but the maid remembered a woman who looked like Sarah, confused, as if out of it. She'd asked to be woken at 7, but when they arrived, the room was empty, the bed untouched. Put out an APB on both of them. Chen put on her raincoat, preparing for a long night. And get me the security footage from that motel. We need to figure out where she went. Already in the car, with the sound of the windshield wipers brushing the rain off the windshield, she reread the last lines from Emily's diary. The girl had written about love with the naivety of youth, not realizing she was playing with fire. She couldn't know what happens when passion meets obsession, and love becomes a deadly poison. Somewhere in the rainy night, two men were hiding, each with a motive for murder. The only thing left to do was to figure out which one of them had crossed the final line, and to find the killer before he left the country. Brooks Modern was considered one of the finest contemporary art galleries in Seattle. Huge floor-to-ceiling windows, snow-white walls, minimalist interior. Everything screamed of the owner's impeccable taste. Detective Chen looked around the room, trying to find a trail that would lead to a clue. It had been a week since the murder, but Sarah Brooks and James Foster seemed to have vanished into the rainy Seattle air. The gallery assistant, Rachel Wong, nervously rubbed her keys as she watched the search. Mrs. Brooks was always very organized. All the paperwork in perfect order, every invoice, every contract. When was the last time you spoke to her? Friday night. She called from Portland asking about a shipment of new work, but her voice sounded strange, like she was crying. I wrote it off to a bad connection. Chen was methodically going through the contents of Sarah's desk when a small safe hidden behind a painting caught her eye. The combination, Emily's date of birth, lent itself on the first try. Inside was a stack of letters tied with red ribbon and a worn envelope with photographs. The pictures showed a young Sarah with her first husband and little Emily, a happy family, and underneath them are printouts of messages from her daughter's cell phone. Dozens of screenshots of correspondence with James, dating back over the last few months. "Boss!" Donovan's voice on the phone sounded agitated. "We've got the motel security footage. Sarah was indeed there, but not alone. James was with her." Analysis of the phone conversations revealed new details. The day before the murder, Sarah had made not just one call from Portland, but 17, all from different payphones. She didn't leave for the fair. She kept an eye on the house. James's college office revealed drafts of letters. "Dear Emily, we have to stop. What is between us is a mistake." The letters had not been sent. "I have a theory." Chen laid out the documents in front of the captain. Sarah found out about her husband's relationship with her daughter early on, staged a trip to catch them, but something didn't go according to plan. A call from the highway patrol interrupted the meeting. "Ma'am, we've located Sarah Brooks. She's at a roadside diner 100 miles south, and she's not alone." Joe's Diner looked like a typical American diner. Worn couches, the smell of French fries, a neon sign flashing in the dusk. Sarah sat at the far table, hunched over a cup of cold coffee. Across from her was James, gaunt, unshaven, with a wan look in his eyes. "I knew it," Sarah said without looking up as the detective sat down at the table. "Knew for a long time. Saw the looks, noticed the touches. My girl, she's always been impressionable. And he took advantage of that." "That's not true." James's voice shook. "I loved her. Loved both of them. I tried to fight my feelings for Emily, but tell me what happened that night." Chen pulled out a tape recorder. The story flowed like a river breaking a dam. Sarah came home early, caught them together. Emily confessed everything, screaming that she loved James, that they had planned to leave together. "I don't remember grabbing the statue," Sarah spoke softly, almost a whisper. "I only remember her eyes, the same ones I had when I was young, when I fell in love with her father, just as naive, just as blind. And then there was blood. A lot of blood." "I was asleep." James covered his face with his hands. "I woke up to screams. When I came running, it was too late. Sarah was standing over her with a bloody statue. I helped her cover her tracks. I couldn't believe it was real." "Why did you run away together?" "Because we're both guilty." Sarah raised her eyes full of tears. "Me for killing. He's for bringing it to this. We thought we could live with that sin alone, but Emily's ghost haunts us everywhere." The arrest went quietly. No resistance, no drama. Two broken people voluntarily got into a police car. A month later, Sarah Brooks pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. James Foster was charged with accessory after the fact to murder and sexual relations with a minor. The gallery was bought by a New York collector. Emily's work was displayed in a small room. Portraits, landscapes, and that last unfinished painting, a female figure with a face contorted with rage. Mrs. Rodriguez continued to come to the house every morning, leaving flowers at the gate. Neighbors tried not to look in the direction of the deserted mansion, But newspaper reporters were still discussing the tragedy in the Queen Anne neighborhood for a long time. Detective Chen often returned her thoughts to the case. Emily's diary, James's letters, Sarah's desperate attempts to keep her family together. Love, jealousy, obsession, the eternal triangle that this time had turned tragic. On the last day of the trial, she walked into the deserted gallery. On the wall hung Emily's self-portrait, a young face with eyes full of hope. That's how they remained in her memory. The mother who couldn't bear the betrayal, the stepfather who crossed the line, and the girl who paid with her life for the illusion of love. The rain outside the window intensified, drumming on the glass of the gallery. Seattle mourned another tragedy that had occurred under the cover of its eternal clouds.